Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and free trade, the case for suspending trade rules. This webinar is jointly organized by Public Services International and Education International. My name is Susanna. I am the Trade Justice Coordinator for Public Services International here in Asia Pacific, and I'll be moderating this session. We will have interpretation to Thai to this webinar. And in the chat box, you can find the explanation on how to connect. The icon for interpretation is down below your screen, and you have to choose the Chinese channel to have interpretation to Thai. A few housekeeping announcements. We request you all to put your name and your country in the participants list. So for doing so, again, if you look at the screen down below, there is an icon for participants. If you click on it, you will have the list of participants appear on your right or on your phone. By hovering around the name, you can rename it, tap on it, and you can then put your name and your country. We would like to be able to reproduce a bit the feel of a meeting within the limitations of the online tools that you are using. So while we request you to keep your microphone on mute, we encourage you to turn on your camera so that we can all see each other. Please turn on your camera if you would like to. It's very important though that you keep your microphone on mute so that there is no disturbance during the presentations. We will have two presentations. Feel free to write your questions in the chat box at any time. Once the presentation are over, we will invite comments as well as questions from representative from trade unions. So all of you are very welcome to prepare to intervene at that point. We are hoping to have a very interactive session. This session is meant both as capacity building to understand better how the trade regime has an impact on the moment that we are all living of a pandemic and an unprecedented economic crisis. But we don't want to limit this to capacity building, and we also hope that we can identify actions that unions can take, either join existing initiatives that are already going on, or starting new ones either within countries or jointly across different countries. So these are also things that we would like you to keep in mind, think about, so that we can spend at least the second half of the 2 hours that we have today to think about those. So today we have with us today we have with us Yokling Chi. Can you please keep your microphone on mute? Yes. So today we have Yokling Chi, who is the director of Third World Network, and Sanya Red-Smith, who is legal advisor at Third World Network. And they will make the initial interventions. We will start right away with Yokling. And so Yokling, the world is grappling with a crisis of immense dimension and impact. And how does the trade regime impact on the ability of governments to respond to the pandemic, as well on the government's ability to develop a response to the economic crisis that is unfolding? Can you please give us some ideas of that? And Sanya also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. I think there's some problem with interpretation. Do you want to quickly deal with that first on the chat box? I think the interpretation is not working.
Can people hear the Thai interpretation on the Chinese channel?
Susanna, you're on mute. Yeah.
For those who want interpretation to Thai, they need to choose the Chinese channel.
But when they give yeah.
Okay, because when I chose the Chinese channel, I couldn't hear any Thai interpretation. But maybe others can hear it.
Yeah, other can hear.
Not, can I get a sense from you if we're okay to start? Yes?
Okay, should we just start then? Okay, and hope the interpretation will work. Right, thank you so much, Susanna, and to the organizers for inviting myself and Sanya from Third World Network to come and share some of the information and have this discussion this afternoon. And good afternoon to all our friends from the region. Hope you're all keeping well. What we are going to do is basically, before we go into some of the specific aspects, I just wanted to make a few general points. Number one, even before the COVID pandemic, many of us who have been following trade negotiations and whether trade agreements really bring us, create jobs, secure jobs, whether they bring in investment, help us to develop our national economies, help our small and medium-sized businesses, help our farmers. I mean, these were questions that we have all been exploring and doing lobby work on, right? So what is very clear from all the research in the past 20 years at least, there is no evidence to make a direct link between signing lots of trade agreements, lots of investment agreements, that signing these agreements will bring us foreign investment, will increase the ability of our countries to develop our economy and bring development and create jobs. So that's number one I want to stress. There is no evidence to link high intellectual property protection or lots and lots of trade agreements and economic agreements and investment agreements to bringing in the kind of investment that we need. So what is happening now with the pandemic, as we all know, the public health crisis has meant that for many of our countries, I think almost all our countries in this region, we have had very severe lockdown so that we do not overwhelm. The more sick people, the more they're really, really sick, then the hospitals cannot cope. If the health system breaks down, that would be a disaster. Not just for the COVID patient, but for all who need health services and support. So shutting down the country to deal with the pandemic was really a big decision to make. That means, of course, the social impact, economic impact, businesses, jobs, and many people have lost their jobs, not even just coming back to their jobs. So these we know. Now, what we see happening now, as some of our countries are able to manage the virus and the pandemic, others are just beginning to see more cases. But in every situation, governments are very pressured to open up the economy, right? So balancing between lives and livelihoods and the economy is really the struggle of all our governments and of society as well. The assumption now by many of the politicians in our countries is that one of the ways to do economic recovery is to sign or finish up the agreements that they've been negotiating on different aspects of trade, investment, and different economic sectors of our economy. So there is a strong belief that if we sign and complete these negotiations, then this will be a signal and we will get more investments and we can be having this as a recovery. And this is something in this discussion today, we want to show that it's not actually the way to go. In fact, what the pandemic has shown us is that there are measures, and we will go through and give examples along the way today, Sanya and myself, especially Sanya. Many of the things that our governments have done actually requires us to have the national policy space to actually, even if you needed to, for example, yes?
Please speak a bit slower.
Oh, sorry, okay. And for some governments, we may even need to consider, and this includes even the developed countries like the United States or in Europe, they may even have to somehow do a nationalization of some of the private hospitals or private production to be able to make the essential necessary products, right? So these and a lot of capital, a lot of money has been leaving our countries, investors who are not here for long term, but who are bringing in, sort of portfolio investment. A lot of capital flight, as we call it, had been leaving many of our countries. So are our governments able to control capital flight, for example, right? So these are the many things we will go into a little bit more detail in this discussion this afternoon, but to show that really what is the number one lesson? We need national policy space to be able to take the measures, not just to deal with the pandemic, but for recovery, yeah? So this is the second point I wanted to make, signing these agreements, rushing to this, finishing these agreements is not going to help us with the real economic social recovery. The other thing before we go into the slides, I just wanted, for some of you who may not be so familiar with the process of making agreements. Now we hear things like RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, bilateral trade agreements, regional agreements. What does this all mean? Okay, starting at the top, we have, of course, the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization is supposed to be, well, most countries of the world are members of the WTO. And that's where we have what we call the multilateral negotiations. The idea there is that all countries come together. Some of them are very, very poor, like the least developed countries in the United Nations, need a lot of policy space. They cannot be treated the same as Europe or North America or even Malaysia or Singapore. So we have a very clear understanding in the multilateral system that is developed countries, developing countries, and least developed countries. And in our region, in Asia, we have LDCs too, right? Like Cambodia, for example. So we have what we call equity. So the rules of the trade system in the WTO recognizes that there are differences in our economy and our needs for technology development. So the poorer countries take on less obligations, have more room. For example, in intellectual property, LDCs don't have to implement practically all the provisions of the agreement on intellectual property in the WTO until 2021. And for medicines, they don't have to give pharmaceutical patents, medicines patents, vaccines patents until 2033. So it's a very special rights of LDCs, yeah? So this is very important in the WTO multilateral system, the issue of equity and differential treatment depending on your level of development. Then we have what we call the regional agreements among regions, like we have ASEAN has regional agreements. You could have ASEAN with other countries in South Asia. So that's what the RCEP is, a regional economic partnership within a geographical region. Then you have what we call bilateral between two countries. And then you have what we call plurilateral. A plurilateral agreement means it is different countries, but across different regions. So it's not called a regional agreement. So for example, the TPP, which had the United States originally, we had Chile, Pacific countries, we had Asian countries, we didn't have South Asia, right? So that's called a plurilateral. And this, I just wanted to give as background because we'll see all kinds of different agreements are all over the place now. The multilateral negotiations require, anytime you want to negotiate a new treaty, a new issue, every member in the WTO must agree before that idea, that issue becomes the content for a negotiation, right? So the terms of reference, or what we call a mandate, the permission for countries to go and negotiate, has to be agreed among the countries. So if it's a bilateral between two countries, then you sit down and you have preliminary discussions, you define what your terms of reference are, and you come to an agreement, and then you start your negotiations, and there are different processes. Now, in the country, who decides to go into a negotiation in the WTO, or a bilateral, or a regional, or a plurilateral? Most of the time, the ministries of trade, international trade, or commerce in our countries play a very important role. Because we think trade is about goods and trading, so it must be the trade ministry. But if we look at, I'll show you two slides of two of the big agreements, you look at the scope and the chapters, it covers practically everything in the economy. So to call them trade agreements is actually giving a wrong impression. So it means that these agreements affect every ministry, affect all of us in society, as consumers, as workers, as producers, as service providers. And that's important, which means that these agreements need to have full public discussion. It needs to be transparent. We need to know what it's about, and we need to know how every one of our countries decide what position to take, what to give in, and what to protect, right? So what happens in real life, of course, is in different countries, there are different consultation processes, but in the end, it is the International Trade or Commerce Ministry that actually does the final trade-off. Right? Ministry of Health can make their positions. Ministry of in charge of small, medium businesses can do what they want to do. The Labor Ministry, Human Resources Ministry may want to fight to protect, workers, job security, etc. But ultimately, in reality, the Trade Ministry that leads the negotiations have a lot of power. In most of our countries, we don't need these agreements to go to Parliament to be able to become law in our country, or for our country to agree to take on and sign as a legally binding agreement. Most countries, Philippines, I think is an exception, but or India, but
การ
most
ตัด
of
สิน
our
ใจที่จะเอาหรือไม่เอาแบบข้อตกลงด้านการค้า
until you suddenly have signed the agreement by the government, the executive, and then Parliament is told you have to change 50 laws, 100 laws, right, to change the entire structure of your country legally. Then only they get to know most of the time. So this is really the situation generally in many of our countries. So once you start negotiations, there may be some discussions, but most of the time it's very secretive. In some countries, NGOs, unions, civil society groups, farmers organizations have pressed our governments to do consultation in a more formal way so that we know what is in the text. Most of the time, we don't know what's in the text, yeah? And then there will be these negotiations that can go on for years sometimes. And depending on how much countries want to give, don't want to give, want to protect, it can take a long time. And it's technical, it's legal. Most of our countries don't even have lawyers who go to these negotiations. If you contrast to developed countries like the US or the EU, they have lots and lots of lawyers who actually go in there and they control a lot of the text, which is something we need to think about. Then finally, when everything is agreed and you give and take, you go sector by sector, what you're willing to give up and open up and things like that, what you can try to save, whether we have done the right thing enough to protect ourselves is a lot of analysis. There's no cost benefit analysis done most of the time before or during. And then when it's all towards the end, there's a lot of political pressure to sign, like we see happening, right? Sometimes you spend 10 years negotiating not to sign, not to join, seems to be so terrible. So there's no longer about whether it really benefits our society or how bad it is. It's about how we must all be seen to be, in the family of ASEAN, signing an agreement. And that is very dangerous. So once the agreement is concluded and all the text has been sorted out by the lawyers, we have a treaty. And then countries will decide, we will sign, okay? The two steps before a country, a society is legally bound, how legally binding, when it's legally binding, depends on two steps. One, the finished or concluded agreement, the government responsible will sign, the ministry responsible will sign the agreement. And then you will have the next step called ratification. You have to ratify. And that is a legal step that's needed. So you could have signed an agreement, but your country has not ratified, then the country is not legally bound to follow the provisions of that agreement yet. So sometimes you find that countries have signed, but in the end, maybe there's been a debate afterwards in the country, they look at it again, a new government came into power, they did a review, and they say, oh, actually, this is quite dangerous for the country. And therefore, they choose not to ratify. Okay, very important. So when you see some of the slides, you see the words signed, not ratified, this is what it means, okay? And then when you have every treaty will have, okay, maybe 4 or 5 or 7 countries need to sign before the whole treaty enters into force. And so you will find that in some treaties never came into force because they never had enough countries. And how many countries will depend on what you agree in the treaty. Okay, those are just general points I wanted to make. Can we go into the first slide quickly now? Yeah.
And Joachim, please remember to keep your pace a bit slow.
Okay, right. All right. So I hope that was just background that was helpful. All right. The next, please, the slide. Right now, these are, don't be afraid. I think we'll share the slides later. You see just some examples, right? Some of the future negotiations that have gone on, right, or going on. We have put a list of countries here that are in our region. The ones in bold are the ones we were told are in this afternoon's discussion, maybe more. So you see the first one is CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? This is actually, if you look at the bottom, there's a note there. The USA was part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. They were the ones who actually led it. Most of the agreements, which are very bad for developing countries and LDCs, were really pushed by the US. The Trump administration, so this was concluded, signed by all the parties involved, all the countries involved, and then the USA walked out, if you remember, when Trump became president, all right? So, they did not sign. They did not sign or ratify, sorry, okay? So the USA did not ratify, so they're out. Then Japan and New Zealand and all these countries decided we must still go on with this agreement. So they changed the name and it's called the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership, right? CPTPP. But apart from the US not being there, some of the very controversial provisions on intellectual property that would have affected our access to medicines and health, Those were suspended. There's some provisions, about 22 were suspended. They're still in the CPTPP, but they were suspended. That means they won't be, they won't enter into force until later, but they're still there. They haven't gone away. Okay, this is very important to remember. The rest of it, a little bit of changes here and there. Some countries came in, new government, and asked for a little bit more of policy space for themselves. But as a whole, this treaty called the CPTPP is the same as the TPP. So everything we were worried about the TPP is the same. There's a lot of confusion even among some politicians and members of parliament and the public that this is a better agreement because it's a different agreement. It is not, all right? The bulk of all the things in the TPP is part of the CPTPP. Okay, that's what's important to remember. So if you look at the CPTPP, enough countries and the formula of the that agreement is in force, right? So you can see which are the countries that have already ratified. Brunei signed, did not ratify, okay? China and India were not part of this agreement at all. Indonesia has expressed some interest in joining. Depending on who is the minister and the government, we have seen yes and no interest, so that's something to be concerned about. Malaysia signed and has not ratified. We've had a huge campaign in this country. We've done, the government, the previous government has done a big detailed cost-benefit analysis, and we don't know what's going to happen, but the civil society and the unions campaign continues to say we should not ratify. And then you see that Thailand, there is, we have Thai friends who are here. We know that the Thai government is very keen to join, at least at the top. We know the Ministry of Health is very, very worried. There's a big process going on, and we hope that we can actually help to our friends who are working on this in Thailand, okay? It's in force for Vietnam, for Singapore, etc. So that's the CPTPP, right? And then you have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is supposed to be concluded. All the final details are supposed to be brushed up and cleaned up. And there's supposed to be a ministerial meeting in November this year where the ministers will come together, maybe prime ministers, to actually have a signing ceremonial. So we here see negotiating because the last bits are still going on, although yesterday or a few days ago, there was a ministerial meeting on Zoom and they said we're almost there. India has decided to leave for the time being. We don't know whether India will come back. And some of these issues will be discussed by Sanya. So that's going on, which is a very important part of our work in this region. This is something that we need to look at very seriously. Then the European Union has got FTA negotiations with ASEAN. That's going on. You can see the different status. And then you have other countries in Europe which are not members of the European Union. This is EFTA, the EFTA. These are like Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland. So this is another European treaty, and they're still being negotiated. These are the EFTA with individual countries. So you can see some countries have already signed, it's in force, others are negotiating. Indonesia has finished, they've signed, and now Indonesia is talking about ratification. Then it will bind Indonesia when that happens, okay? So you have all that. And then you have Japan and ASEAN, and you have all kinds of things. This is just to give you an idea that, and this is not the complete list, that we have to learn about all this, think about how to do this, okay? How do we react to all this, okay? Now there is, next one please. Next slide. Now, Indonesia is probably the only country that we know where there's a website on the Ministry of Trade, yeah, in the country where you can have a list like this. This is from the website, yeah, of the Indonesian Ministry of Commerce or Trade. So EIF means has entered into force. These are agreements that Indonesia has already signed, either bilateral with Japan, for example, or with Pakistan, or with ASEAN countries, etc. So you have a list, you know, if you're Indonesian, what are the ones that already are in force? And then you have the second list, concluded already, and now the process of ratification is going on. So this is a hot area of activity, potentially, because Indonesia has not ratified yet. If there are problems there, we need to think about how to persuade the government to slow down and review. Ongoing, you have another long list. And then future, there's already intention, preliminary discussions, or maybe some terms of reference, and these are the future ones. So this is the only country in our region where you can at least go to a website of the government and get an updated list. The rest of us don't have even this information. Okay, next. Next slide, yeah. So in the WTO, remember I was saying WTO is where you have multilateral negotiations. But over the years, because developing countries and LDCs have come together and resisted some of the new ideas that were being put in to liberalize more of our economies. They've been very difficult to get new agreements to be started in the WTO. So a very, very sneaky technique that has been used is to push in what we call plurilateral. Remember I told you earlier on, plurilateral agreements are among the a certain number of countries. They can be in different regions, right? Now in the WTO, the rule is, even if you want to do a plurilateral agreement, because some countries may not want to do it, but all the members of the WTO must agree that you can start a plurilateral negotiation process, right? It's democracy, because every member must agree. Even I don't want to join, but just to start the agreement negotiations, you must have everybody to agree. In recent years, the developed countries, the Secretariat of the WTO have actually pushed ahead and actually started negotiations without the full membership of WTO agreeing that you can do it. So right now you have plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce. You have something on services, domestic regulations, whatever the name is. It means you want to open up and don't regulate services sector in the country, and basically allow foreign companies, to come in and do what they want largely. And there are also plurilateral investment facilitation negotiations. And all these negotiations are about reducing government policy space, reducing public regulation, and giving more rights to foreign investors, banks, services, etc. So that's that. The first row has something called MPIA. I'm not going to go into that in detail, because what that means is right now, because the United States under the Trump administration has blocked all the appointments of new appellate, because when you have a dispute in the WTO, you can take a country to a dispute system. You have hearings, it's very, a lot of procedure for dispute settlement. And after a decision is given, you can appeal to an appellate board. It's like a court in our countries, right? You lose at one level, you can, or you win, or when you lose, you can actually appeal. So the appellate board has members which are selected, and the membership has to approve. But the United States have blocked the appointment of new members to the appellate board. So there's only one member left. And so the whole system has actually, since December last year, not functioned. So a few countries led by the EU, the European Union, and about 17 other countries, including China, Singapore, they have joined this thing called a temporary, this is a multi-party interim appeal system. All right, that's what the MPIA is. And not all countries have supported it. They're not happy with it necessarily. So you have India, for example, is not in it, right? Or of course the US is not in it. But this is something that is also a new creature that is lurking now in the WTO. All right, just for your information. Next. The next two slides are just very quickly to show you, when we hear something is a partnership, economic cooperation, economic agreement, economic partnership, or whatever, look at the chapters, look at the scope. It covers everything practically in your economy, and affects all our lives in every way, okay? Whether it's rural, whether it's urban, whether it's small businesses, our local companies, our state-owned enterprises, they're all covered. And the main message of all these agreements is deregulate and allow foreign companies, foreign actors to come into the country and be treated equally, even better than your domestic companies and businesses. Next. So this is CPTPP. These are the chapters. It's the whole CPTPP is available. It's in force, so that you can look at the whole treaty. The RCEP, these are the chapters. We don't know what is in there in the end, because all the chapters, all the negotiations are also secretive. We don't know. The only thing we know are the chapters which were leaked a number of years ago. And we can tell that most of them are the same as CPTPP. Some chapters are worse, some chapters are better, depending on how countries negotiated and how much there was civil society and unions coming in to do lobbying and advocacy in all our countries. So these two slides are just to show you how broad the scope is, and therefore it's the impact, and if there are not good agreements, it's very dangerous. So in the pandemic situation, are we really, really comfortable? Should we even be going into any of these negotiations when the pandemic has showed us we need to have so many kind of actions to be taken that needs policy space? Because of this concern in the WTO, a number of developing countries have objected, because in the midst of all this, they want to do virtual negotiations, things like that. And most countries are so involved in dealing with COVID, they're not even aware of what's happening, right? So there are a number of developing country ambassadors to the WTO who have said in the last few months in the WTO, some of the meetings, that we should not be going on with WTO negotiations. 400 civil society organizations have signed on to a big open letter saying that we should stop all trade and investment treaty negotiations in the WTO, in the bilaterals, in the plurilaterals, etc. Stop all of this during the pandemic period, because you cannot sneak in and put into place all these agreements, which are very, very bad, not just for the health recovery, but also for our economic recovery. Okay, so I will stop there. I think I've taken more than 10 minutes, but just to give a background, and Sanya will continue.
Thank you so much.
Sana, you may want to do the next slide as well. So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think you've put a lot of points in perspective, and the point that there is no evidence that the rules that are proposed in the trade regime create more national development. I think that's very important in the context where when we see what we see in the newspapers is to say that we need to sign one of these treaties, RCEP, because of the recovery. So important to know that there is no evidence to that. Not only that there is no evidence, but that actually these impact on the policy space, which is what is required for the recovery. And I think we will speak in more detail of different elements of what that policy space means and how that works. I think the important point to say that this is really not about trade, it's about the economy. It covers all the sectors, and therefore the people who either depend on those sectors for work or for getting services and goods. So we are all affected by them. The important point of the lack of strong democratic processes around these agreements, which is made worse by the fact that there is also even a kind of a secrecy and an intention to negotiate secretly behind closed doors. And I think that's very interesting also how you showed that despite all of that, there are important political dynamics which kind of come to play an important role nearly as blackmail. You know, we've done so much work now, you can't let us down. Kind of is what the executive will come and tell the parliament when the parliament has not been involved in all of this. And I think it was very important that you showed us also how, you know, these trade rules end up impacting all of the countries in the region. It might be that the vehicles are different. For some people, it might be the CPTPP. For some people, it might be RCEP. But at the end of the day, all of our countries are involved in either the WTO or more trade agreements. And then there will of course be nuances in, you know, the nature of the text that creates some differences too. We will go to Sanya, who is going to give us, is going to dive into this even more.
Okay.
But I just wanted to see if there are any clarification questions.
Hi, Susanna.
Yes.
Excuse me. Before we proceed to our next topic, I would just like to ask our resource person to speak a bit slowly so our translator can translate it simultaneously. Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. We just need to maybe slower speaking so our translator can translate it well. Okay. Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico, for the reminder.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Also to remind the participants if they can change the name that they have in the participants list. So if you look down your screen, you can see a participants icon. And then when you click on that, you will see the list of participants. Your name will come first. Sometimes it will not be your name, but that of your phone. So you need to tap on it and change it to your name and the country you're from. That will really help for the discussions to be able to, you know, cover the specific impacts that it has for different countries. So please don't forget to do that. Also, just to apologize that we had planned to have interpretation to Bahasa, but then at the last minute there was impossibility for the interpreter to come. So that's why there is only Thai interpretation and not Bahasa interpretation. So apologies for our friends from Indonesia. Is there any clarificatory question at this point on the presentation made by Joaquin? I can hear, but I'm not sure if it's a question of, okay. So I take it that we don't have questions at this point, and I'll invite Sanya to make her presentation. Thanks, Sanya.
Thank you. Let me just unmute. Yes, so on the next slide, please, I'll start now to look at some of the provisions in these trade and investment treaties that can restrict the ability of governments to deal with the pandemic and its economic crises. So the first one is intellectual property. So this is things like patents on medicines. And this is required for all WTO members, which is 164 countries. So most of your countries are probably in the WTO. And it has to be a 20-year monopoly on things like medicines and vaccines and other technology like ventilators, except if you're a least developed country. You have a transition period for as long as you're least developed. And so we know that when medicines were patented, for example, for HIV/AIDS, they cost $15,000 US per patient per year. When that monopoly finished after 20 years and generic companies could make the same medicine but cheaper versions and compete, then the price fell to $64 per patient per year for the same medicine. So it's much more affordable when the monopoly finishes because of the patent is over and you can have competition. So in this pandemic, there are problems for intellectual property for a number of things, because there can be patents on the masks, hundreds of patents on the masks that people need, the N95 masks, the medicines, whichever one we find will be effective, the vaccine when it comes, the ventilator parts. There's also different types of intellectual property protection. So there's trade secret protection on the recipe for the test kit chemicals, which remember there was a shortage and they couldn't have enough test kits because Roche couldn't make enough, and then there's hardly any exceptions that allow generic companies to make generic versions of this chemical to make the test kits work. If you remember the ventilator valves, when there weren't enough ventilators, people were 3D printing valves to make them work, but you could do that for like $1 or something, but it could violate the industrial design protection on the ventilator valve, and then the company was selling them, I think, for $1,000 per ventilator valve if you pay the monopoly price, whereas you could 3D print it for $1 if there was no industrial design protection on that ventilator valve. Oh, sorry, it was $11,000 each at the monopoly price. But if you 3D print it, a generic version, it's $1. And in the WTO, you have 10 years of industrial design protection, but in free trade agreements like the EU is proposing to Indonesia, they want that monopoly to last for 25 years. And then there's copyright protection, like on textbooks, but also on ventilator software and other things you need for this pandemic. So you can see that's under the WTO, already bad enough. And those rules aren't called TRIPS in the WTO. But in free trade agreements, it goes beyond that, what we call TRIPS Plus, for even longer and stronger intellectual property protection. And I give you examples here of what the EU has proposed to Indonesia, and that negotiation is moving pretty fast. So they asked for even longer patents on medicines, more than 20 years, if Indonesia is too slow in approving them. Even if there's no patent on the medicine, there's an potentially 11-year monopoly, so the high price for 11 years, and the industrial design protection on ventilator valves from 10 years to 25 years. So this makes it even harder for governments to afford the technology they need to deal with the pandemic, either this pandemic or the next one, because we know there will be another pandemic. We had bird flu, we had swine flu, we had SARS, we had MERS, now we have COVID-19. So there will be another pandemic. It's just a question of when. So that's on the intellectual property side. But there's also a problem from the goods side. So as you remember, in this pandemic, there have not been enough masks, for example. Everybody was trying to buy them. The US was, paying more for them on the tarmac in China to steal them from France. So if countries say, look, for the next pandemic, we want to make sure we don't have a shortage of masks again. We want to make sure we have some domestic mask producing industries. The way to build that between the pandemics is to raise the tariffs on imported masks between the pandemics so that your domestic mask producing factories can start and they don't have to compete with cheaper imported masks. And this is called infant industry tariff protection. And you can see it's how all industrialized economies except Hong Kong develop their industry. But in the World Trade Organization, countries like New Zealand and Singapore have said to deal with this pandemic, we should remove tariffs on things like masks and medical gowns and all the technology you need forever. So nobody can ever develop their own mask industry, and we'll be stuck with the same shortage problems in the next pandemic. It's this in free trade agreements like the CPTPP, you also have to remove tariffs on basically everything. So that would include imported masks and other medical technology. So you couldn't build up your domestic supply capacity between pandemics so you're ready for the next one. And we'll talk later about how government procurement could also be used to build up domestic industries so you don't have to depend on this global value chain, which we saw didn't work in this pandemic. But that's liberalized in some free trade agreements. And of course, if you remove these tariffs on imported products, that's an important source of revenue, especially for developing countries, because it's the easiest revenue to collect. So you may not want to put tariffs on masks right now in this pandemic, but before the next one, you may want to raise them again, and it can be a source of revenue. And because for developing countries, it's easier to collect tariffs than value-added tax or income tax, this is more important as a source of revenue for developing countries than for developed countries. And the IMF says that if low-income countries remove tariffs on imports and they try to make back that lost tariff revenue by, say, introducing a value-added tax or other taxes, at best they make back 30% of that lost revenue. So it's a permanent loss of 70% of that government revenue. And that means the salaries for public sector workers or workers in state-owned enterprises and so on. Next slide, please. So there are some other trade rules that can affect the kinds of things that governments want to do to deal with this pandemic. So as Yokling said, most countries are doing lockdowns, right? They shut the bars, the restaurants to try and stop the transmission of this virus. But in these trade agreements, they often have services liberalization. And services you can think of as everything you cannot drop on your foot. So shops, bars, restaurants, McDonald's, cinemas, and obviously hospitals and universities and schools and so on. These are all services. And in these trade treaties, what happens is you liberalize services, which means you don't restrict the number of these services that can be provided in the sectors that you liberalize. So if you have liberalized restaurants and bars, for example, in the WTO or in your European Union Free Trade Agreement, and then you lock it down and say restaurants and bars you cannot operate for the next 6 months or the next 1 month, that violates your commitment in Services Market Access Mode 3 to allow as many of these bars and restaurants to open 24 hours as much as they want. So this is a problem in the Japan-ASEAN Services and Investment Chapter, which some of the countries on this call have already signed, or all of them have signed, some have ratified, some have not yet ratified. It's in the leaked RCEP text because, of course, these free trade agreement negotiations generally happen in secret. So we don't get the texts until the negotiations have concluded and it's too late to change anything. But we often have leaked texts. So in RCEP, a number of the chapters have leaked, and that's how we know it's also proposed there. The EU does publish their proposals recently in their free trade agreement negotiations, so we can see that they propose this to Indonesia and so on. But the same for partial reopening. So some of the countries now, they've got the pandemic under control. They're saying, okay, bars and restaurants, you can reopen, but only half capacity, only half the normal number of people who would sit in your restaurant. This is also a market access restriction, so would also violate your services commitments in those sectors. So governments should be re-looking at what they committed in RCEP to make sure that their lockdown measures, for example, don't violate their services commitments in RCEP, where they promise to allow as many bars and restaurants as they want, as full as they want, 24 hours a day. But I don't know if any governments are doing that. They should be all reviewing the rules and the commitments they have made in these trade negotiations before it's too late, before they conclude and sign and then ratify, of course. The other thing that some governments are doing in this pandemic is because the pandemic caused the stock market to crash, your companies have become very cheap. So for example, Indian companies that are actually quite healthy in normal times before the pandemic are now very cheap to buy on the stock market. So maybe Chinese companies are coming in and trying to buy up these Indian companies. And so India, for example, restricted the ability of Chinese companies to buy up Indian companies as a result of the fall in their price in the pandemic. And so did Australia and New Zealand. They increased their FDI screening. And this violates a number of services and investment rules under these treaties, national treatment, market access, in India's case, most favored nation, because you're treating China worse than other countries. So Australia and New Zealand, for example, are violating their commitments under the CPTPP already with their FDI screening as a result of this pandemic. So they should be re-looking at what they've agreed in RCEP and be willing to reopen it, because they should have realized that they're already in trouble and breaking the FTA rules with things like their FDI screening. And we'll see later if the exceptions will save them. Next slide, please. As Yokling mentioned, there's been a record capital outflow from emerging economies in this pandemic crisis. The money is running out of developing countries. So they may want to do capital controls to stop the money running out the way that Malaysia did to deal with the Asian financial crisis in 1998. But if you do these kinds of capital controls, this can violate your services market access commitments, the investment chapter, for example, in the CPTPP, the Japan-ASEAN investment chapter, the leaked text of RCEP, the EU's proposal to Indonesia, bilateral investment treaties. They say you must freely allow the money to leave the country as much as it wants. And it even seems to be proposed in the WTO plurilateral investment facilitation negotiations. And you could see on slide 4 the countries that are participating in that. And sorry, Bangladesh, I didn't know you'd be on this call, so I didn't list your country there, but you can see in the footnotes how to look up if your countries are participating in this. Then some of these have exceptions saying, okay, you can use capital controls, but they are usually only in very limited circumstances, like serious crises, and you have to meet in the CPTPP 2.5 pages of conditions that are very difficult to satisfy. You can only have capital controls for 1.5 years. You can only get an extension in certain circumstances. And the Japan-ASEAN's exception for capital controls is also extremely difficult to use and only in limited circumstances. So governments may not be able to stop the money running out of their countries because of these provisions in free trade agreements or the same things in bilateral investment treaties. Then for some countries, the IMF and the World Bank are worrying that there's going to be a new debt crisis for developing countries because of the pandemic. So some countries may need to do sovereign debt restructuring, where they say, look, we're not going to repay 100% of what we borrowed. We're going to do a haircut and only pay, say, 75%. This is what Argentina did in its financial crisis and so on. But if you do this, this can violate various free trade agreement investment chapter and bilateral investment treaty provisions. And you can see the link to the UNCTAD document there. And some, like the CPTPP, have a partial exception for sovereign debt restructuring, but it's only to some of the rules and only if 75% of the bondholders agree. So for example, one of Argentina's sovereign debt restructurings, only 66% of bondholders agreed, so you couldn't use this exception. And many free trade agreements like Japan-ASEAN and bilateral investment treaties have no exception for sovereign debt restructuring, so if you do it, you can be sued. Next slide, please. So how are these rules enforced? Everything that I've said so far is usually enforced in these trade agreements by governments suing each other at an international tribunal. And as Yokling explained, there's normally an appeal process, which is not working at the moment in the WTO. And then if you lose at that, normally in the WTO, the winning country can raise the tariffs, the taxes, on your country's exports until you change your law to comply. So this is much more enforceable than an ILO treaty or health, treaty or human rights treaty and so on. And the same for free trade agreements in this state-to-state dispute settlement. So for most WTO members now, because the appellate body is not working, you are free to violate the WTO rules and there can be no penalties imposed on your country for doing so, except the countries who volunteered to join this MPIA that the EU set up, this interim arrangement, which is on slide 4, the countries who have joined that. If your country joined that, like China, Australia, New Zealand, and the EU is asking everybody to join, then the WTO rules are enforceable for you, including in the pandemic. So if you don't give 20-year monopolies on the medicine or vaccine that's going to save people's lives from this pandemic, then you could be sued under the WTO rules and tariffs on your exports until you comply. In addition, the investment chapter of these free trade agreements or the bilateral investment treaties also have investor-to-state dispute settlement, ISDS. So this allows the foreign investor, say McDonald's, to sue the Malaysian government at an international tribunal for unlimited monetary compensation, cash, because McDonald's was shut down during the pandemic and they lost profits for how many months, for example. And investors can win a lot of money. So there's 13 cases where they're known to have won more than $1 billion each. For example, Pakistan lost a case and they had to pay the investor $6 billion, which was their entire IMF loan. They had to give to one investor because they lost one case. So they had all the conditionality of the IMF loan and they couldn't use it for anything. They just had to give it straight to a foreign investor when they lost the ISDS case. We don't know, so what kinds of things could be challenged? You can see on the slide that law firms are already advising investors about how they can use this ISDS to sue governments for the steps they've taken for the pandemic. Peru has already been threatened via ISDS because they said don't pay tolls during the pandemic. And governments could be sued, for example, because of lockdowns, because of taking over private hospitals, because of saying that borrowers don't have to repay their mortgages or can't be kicked out for not paying rent during the pandemic, or because of stopping foreign takeovers, or because of stopping people's waters from being cut off during the pandemic to ensure they can wash their hands, or steps to make sure medicines and vaccines are affordable, or for doing sovereign debt restructuring and so on. So there's a sign-on letter you'll see on the second last slide that says that civil society calling for ISDS not to be allowed for these pandemic measures, and that's still open. You can still sign on to that. But it's very, and you can see there's on this slide, it says, what are your existing investment treaties or FTA investment chapters? So you can see if your country has joined these, and also if it's signed some but not yet ratified. So they shouldn't bring them into force because we know it's particularly bad for pandemic measures. And it's hard to know who is negotiating which of these investment treaties because most governments don't say it publicly. Only Canada is the only one I really know, and you can see they're negotiating with India. And these can be negotiated pretty quickly, like in a week. So it's very hard to know if your government's negotiating, and it can all be done pretty quickly. And there's a link at the bottom which shows you if your government's already been sued in the past in these cases. So there are some other rules that can affect pandemic measures. So for example, the e-commerce rules being pushed in the WTO plurilateral, and you can see which countries have joined that on slide 4. And the e-commerce chapter of the CPTPP and EU FTAs and so on. So we know that in this pandemic, everybody's using the internet much more, for example, to download Netflix or something. And so the ban on tariffs on these electronic transmissions means even more revenue will be lost than normal. And those bans are in the CPTPP and the EU Free Trade Agreement proposal to Indonesia. And there's some analysis later in this PowerPoint about the implications of that. In the WTO plurilateral, they're also saying you should join the information technology agreements at the WTO, which is to remove tariffs on IT products, which means you lose tariff revenue. They're saying you should liberalize services, which worsens your balance of payments problems. They're saying you should have cross-border data flows like in the CPTPP. So those contact tracing apps, which say if you've been standing next to somebody who's got COVID-19, that data can record where you are, your location, including of your prime minister and your military and where you went. And if that data is stored offshore, for example, in the US, it has no privacy protections. So that can be sold to people who say, okay, I know you are poor, therefore I target you for loan sharks, or I know where your military is, and so on. So that's some of the problems from the e-commerce proposals. And then lastly, if we're talking about recovery, in the recovery, governments may want to say, look, we want to help our local economy restart. So the government is going to ensure that they buy from domestic suppliers, whether that's farmers, so you buy from domestic farmers to supply rice for the military or the public hospitals, or you buy from domestic paper producers for the paper for the photocopiers and the offices. This government procurement can be 25% of your economy, for example, in Malaysia. And in the CPTPP and the EU's Free Trade Agreement proposal to Indonesia, it says that this government purchasing must be opened for the ministries listed, which was all of them in Malaysia at the national government level, for contracts above a certain size, for products, in Malaysia's case, almost all of them, and the services listed, you just buy from the cheapest country in the free trade agreement. You can't direct that to your local producers and suppliers. So it makes it hard to direct that government purchasing to the local economy, including any local state-owned enterprises like the GPO in Thailand, which produces generic medicines and so on. Next slide, please. So that was the bad news. The good news is, well, there are some exceptions to these trade and investment treaties. There's a health exception usually. In the WTO, this health exception is very difficult to use. It has only worked once in 44 attempts. That was asbestos. It failed for things like tobacco control because you have to pass all these different tests, and that health exception does not apply to the intellectual property rules. In free trade agreements like the CPTPPs, they usually copy this same health exception into the free trade agreement. So it's also difficult to use. And in the CPTPP, it does not apply to the intellectual property or investment chapters. There is also a security exception. So you could try and argue that, oh, locking down McDonald's was for security reasons during the pandemic. But this security exception in the WTO leaves it to the WTO's panel to decide if locking down McDonald's was really for essential security in a time of emergency in international relations. And I don't know that they would say that locking down McDonald's qualifies. In US free trade agreements, because the US worries about security, they have a bit easier a security exception to use, like in the CPTPP. It doesn't have to be a time of emergency in international relations, but the panel still decides if locking down McDonald's was for essential security or not. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you some further information. And you can see there the sign-on letters that we mentioned, and the second last point shows a South African ambassador saying, this is not the time for rulemaking and negotiating trade rules. Instead, there should be a peace clause so governments can't sue each other for the measures they take in the context of this pandemic. And South Africa's GNI per capita is higher than India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on. So if the South African government thinks this, what should our governments be doing? And even the US trade minister said, in this pandemic is not the time to be making long-term decisions about new trade rules. So why then are our governments still negotiating RCEP, trying to conclude and sign it by November? Why are they still ratifying the Japan-ASEAN services and investment chapters, which have these problematic provisions? And why are they still negotiating EU free trade agreements and joining WTO negotiations, which are going on now in Geneva with the problematic provisions that I mentioned? Next slide, please. So thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much, Sanya. Trinita, could you put back the previous slide, please? You could leave that on the screen just for a minute. Thank you so much. You have gone really to explain how different rules impact on both the response to the pandemic and to the recovery in very concrete ways. The ability to afford health technologies that are impeded by the intellectual property rules, the possibility to develop local capacity to produce that is made difficult by removing tariffs, but also other elements of investment and services rules, the loss of government revenues, you mentioned the tariffs again, but also the removal of the possibility to have tariffs on goods that are traded through e-commerce. These digital services is something that PSI has an interest to work on. For instance, the dangers that come from the measures taken in the lockdown to regulate service providers, screening of FDI, and how all of these can come back to bite through the measures of the investment state dispute settlement mechanism. So there is really a lot of different ways that we can feel the impact, and I think it's very good to see that there has been a coming together of civil society and with unions in many times. So if you see the letters that are mentioned on the slide here, the last one that is to say no to ISDS for pandemic measures is something where trade unions have signed, including PSI and including all the global union federations, and I think many unions who are here have also signed on this letter. There is another letter to stop trade and investment treaties during the pandemic, again that PSI and all the global union federations have signed. But there is, I think, still space for taking this further and bringing it to even more people. And more unions. So these are things that we can discuss also in the hour that we have left. We are now going to open it for comments, for questions, and for also proposals of what unions would like to do. And we have a few more senior trade union representatives who have been part of the previous meetings that PSI and all the global union federations have organized. I think we have Mike, who is from Singapore, from EI, who is with us. Mike, would you like to make the initial comments?
Well, maybe I'll start. Thank you both presenters for, it was quite an enlightening presentation. Can you hear? Yep. Comprehensive, thought-provoking, and especially for the pandemic. In Singapore's case, as you know, Singapore is a trading port. You know, trade, international trade is 3 times Singapore's GDP. Right? So trade is vital. Free trade agreements are essential, but there are certain control sectors that free trade does not come into. In my case, obviously, education, general education. University sector is slightly different, but primary to junior college, high school, it's quite government provided. The other thing that we do slightly differently is when there are free trade agreements being discussed, the unions are involved internally with the Ministry of Trade and Industry to ascertain some of the impact it might have for the local sector in Singapore, right? And the issue I'm grappling with is Sania mentioned number of restrictions can be imposed on the agreements, but it seems like it's very cumbersome. So during the lockdown periods, how do we actually manage this? Or are we like anticipating onslaught of legal suits from investors moving forward? That could be quite disruptive as well, while you are tackling the pandemic now and thereafter to face legal issues vis-a-vis this, that will come out of the FTAs. Yeah, I think it's quite concerning and alarming, right? Because as you know, in Singapore, we have put a lot of restrictions as well, right? Including schools during the lockdown period. We're just opening up next week, in fact, Monday. We are also going into an elections in about 10, 12 days time, general elections. I think the pandemic was truly a curveball for all of us. And it might be a good lesson for the governments as well to relook at FTA negotiations and what they admit and not admit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. You're raising a very important question of the risk of these ISDS cases, and I'm sure Yukin and Sanya will probably respond to that, maybe referring back to the situation that happened in Argentina after the crisis. That could be a good example to give. Before I ask them to respond, let's take a few more comments from the union representatives. Do I have Narasimhan? Narasimhan from the All India Insurance Employees Union.
Yes, I'm there.
Also the representative for South Asia and for the Asia Pacific for PSI. Yes, Narasimhan.
Yeah. First, I would like to have my typical trade union responses. The presentation was extremely good. I would like to simplify it for the clear understanding of my young friends. FTA, though we call it a free trade agreement, it is neither free nor restricted to trade and no agreement with any of the stakeholders. Public services are very clearly visible in the front line to deal with the pandemic. But the efforts being put in by the governments is not to strengthen it, and not in the interest of the people. If you see, the governments are negotiating. If you see, the governments are negotiating the trade agreements. For example, RCEP or any trade agreement, a country A and country B or a group of countries are negotiating with each other regarding the trade in services or goods, whatever it is. But if the market access is restricted, then it is not the other country which is going to sue my country, but it is the multinational corporation of the country which is suing my country. So it is not, though it is negotiated between countries, it is the profit which is the prime concern of the multinational corporations. And I would like to say that through the international financial institutions, public money is being utilized to promote privatization. If you see the policy of the IFIs, it remains often cutting on subsidies and promoting privatization. And if you see in our country, the private healthcare system is being funded against the interest of the public healthcare services during the time of pandemic by a $1 billion support by the World Bank. During the difficult times, electricity is sought to be privatized by introducing a new bill. Corporatization of ordnance factories, restriction of trade union rights, and what are the ills which the trade unions are facing today, the workers are facing today, the people are likely to face in future, it is linked to the trade agreements. If these trade agreements are to be entered into, if they are not in the interest of the people, if they are not in the interest of the workers, that too during the crisis of pandemic, then why now? It is obvious that the public healthcare system or the public employees, public service workers, they are in the front line warriors in these responses. So they are busy. This is the right time to hit them. This is the right time to go ahead without democratic responses from the stakeholders. Hence, we say RCEP or any trade agreement should not be negotiated during the times of crisis and also which is likely to go against the interest of the unions, against the interest of workers, and against the interest of the people at large. So we should be aware and keep campaigning to ensure the safety and interest of public service and public service employees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narasimhan, and bringing also a broader picture of the other kind of, areas where you have a push in a certain direction, in the same way that if free trade agreements support a certain neoliberal understanding of your economy, IFIs come with that similar understanding, and they come together in promoting private provision over public provision, even when we can see that, even when with the COVID, it's been exposed that you need a strong public service and a public service-led response. It's a very important point. I will maybe ask for a few more interventions. Lawrence from the Sabah Medical Services Union, President of the Sabah Medical Services Union. Can you also please intervene?
Thank you, Susanna. And good afternoon all in solidarity. Thank you very much. I think Yokling and Sanya for refreshing us on all those development on the trade issues. I think we are lucky in Malaysia that Yokling knows the situation very well. Yeah, despite the political uncertainty. Yeah, I think our will and our belief in making sure that whatever trade issues or trade negotiations that are taking place, we should be very much involved, you know, as far as the workers are concerned. But as we all know that a lot of these negotiations are being held in a very much in secrecy. So I don't know. We would know the latest, you know, with the change in the ministry setup. So maybe Yokling will be able to update us on that also. And also probably we can also get to hear from our ex-Minister of Trade and Industry, Daryl. Yeah, I think Susanna has mentioned that to me that we can always probably have a link up with him, you know, soon. So as far as our side is concerned, the current global pandemic definitely has brought a lot of awareness to, especially to health workers. Yeah, but despite that, we must say that I don't know whether Yokling will agree with me, but I think the Malaysian government has done quite well, you know, in containing the pandemic. You know, so I think we have done well. I think things are improving. You know, I mean, it's amazing, despite the fact that in the initial stage, I think. The situation is similar with the other countries. There were a lot of shortages in PPEs, yeah, facial masks, of course, and all the test kits, and you don't even have sanitizers. Even if you have the money, you can't buy, yeah. But despite that, I think we have gradually improved on tackling this contagion, and then we are happy to note that as of now, things are brightening up, and the government is loosening a lot of restrictions by July the 1st. And the Prime Minister has also given the assurance that all the SOPs, the standard operating procedures, like social distancing and also making use of facial mask, you know, facial mask. I think this will be in place until and unless a vaccine is found, which we are all hoping that it will be probably by early next year, at the earliest, yeah. So that has been the situation here in Malaysia. I think that's about all that I can share with you all for this session. Thank you, Susanna.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. I think importantly, you pointed to the opportunity for unions in Malaysia to, you know, work along civil society in opposing the CPTPP in a context where the discussion about ratification is being pushed. So we're noting that down, and that's something that we can see how, you know, we can take it forward together. There is a question that has been put in the chat box by Pradnya. Pradnya, do you want to ask it on voice? And yes, do you want to ask it on voice, or would you like me to read it? You can unmute.
It's fine. You can go ahead. Yes, you can go ahead. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
So the question from Pratnya is that we can see that, you know, there is this kind of contradiction between we take forward, does the government put measures that are going to mitigate the health risk or the economic risk? And for informal workers, the economic risks are huge because they have to survive day by day. So these are two issues that are feeding into each other, and now they are, you know, in opposition. It's difficult to prioritize. They both need to be taken up. So how can a balance be maintained? And I think maybe just linking it with the trade discussion, how does the trade framework come in here? You know, again, maybe bringing back to the question of the kind of the policy space that would be required to ensure that both are taken care of. So that's on the list of questions that we can raise. And then I also wanted to ask for an intervention from Joshua, who is the president of Centro in the Philippines. So coming more from a perspective of the manufacturing sector. Joshua, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, thank you, Susanna. And thank you for promoting me. I'm just actually the Secretary General, not the President. But,
sorry, I'm going ahead.
That's all right. That's all right. But I just want to add my voice to all of you who are baffled why RCEP and other free trade agreements are actually pushing through, despite the horrible crisis that we are all facing at this point in time. And today, I just read the papers, and then I saw that our trade minister was quoted urging the countries' partners in ASEAN to, quote, send strong signal that we continue to deepen our economic partnership despite the challenges and uncertainties in the global trade environment. He even claimed that RCEP remains crucial, and this is a quote, RCEP remains crucial in restoring business confidence and maintaining a positive outlook in the region. Now, I think we just need to pause a bit, no, and interrogate it, no, and when you do, you immediately can, be bombarded with a lot of simple questions, So, like for example, would RCEP really restore business confidence? That's a simple question, and more importantly, even if RCEP restores business confidence, would actually restored business confidence address the problems we are facing? I completely doubt that, because in the first place, RCEP was never designed to deal with the kind of pandemic and economic repercussions that we are now facing. I mean, this is the world's worst recession in 150 years. And there is no way they could have imagined the designing an RCEP that can address the kind of dreadful situation that we are facing. So the question is, why do we have to continue negotiating for FTAs and RCEP? Would it actually solve the problems that we are facing now? Would it arrest the spread of COVID-19? Unlike in Malaysia, the Philippines has yet to deal with the COVID virus, the spread of the virus. Would that help? Would RCEP actually solve our severe problems in terms of lack of PPEs, in terms of lack of medicines and medical equipments? Would that really help? Or FTAs and RCEP would on the contrary make these things much more expensive for all of us, because it would just protect corporate IPRs? Would it help countries to build its public health system and enable it to cope with the pandemic? Or on the contrary, actually hamper its efforts to build up its public health system because of several pressures for privatizing? It also begs the question, why pursue RCEP when we are facing, as I said, when we're facing this recession? Would it actually help generate jobs? Would it actually save the jobs of workers? I mean, 70% of our workers in the Philippines today are either underemployed, unemployed, or even employed, but they cannot actually go report for work because of lockdown conditions. Would RCEP be able to respond to that? I'm pretty confident that even governments cannot respond to these questions. And true enough, we actually posed these questions to our trade minister when we met with them a few weeks ago, and they cannot respond to us. And the only thing that when we ask them a simple question, who are the winners and who are the losers? The only thing that they can tell us is that we'd like to refer you to a study that was done 2 years ago. That's just incredible. How can you refer to a study done 2 years ago? And I extremely believe that they will never be able. I'm sorry.
Slower. Just speak slowly.
I'm sorry. So I firmly believe that RCEP, that the government can never answer these questions, because in the first place, as I said, RCEP was never designed to deal with the situation that we're facing. And second, because they are never willing to impart to us the kind of negotiations, the details of the negotiations that they have actually done. So there is no way they can respond to us properly. And more importantly, in the case of the Philippines, how can our trade ministers, trade officials, negotiating officials, actually tell us anything and respond to us properly, when in the first place our government has no clear plans on how to address the problems we are now facing. If not immoral for any government to continue negotiating RCEP, which would only worsen the situation for many, many workers. And this is why, while just listening to everyone, I just realized, I think what we'll do in the next few days is that we will challenge our negotiators in a public debate. Let them debate with us publicly. Let them defend their RCEP and how it will actually help workers. And we will stand our ground and explain to them how it will not help our workers. And let's see who the public will side. Thanks, Susanna.
Thanks, Joshua. I think you asked a lot of questions that you're not expecting to be answered because you already know the response very much. But it's good to put them on the table. I have a hand raised from Tamil Selvi from TNGOU. Tamil Selvi, do you want to ask a question? You can turn on your mic. We cannot hear you. You have to mute yourself.
No,
yes,
no, ma'am. No, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So you can, for all of you, you can use the option of raising your hand if you would like to ask a question. That's also possible. Or continue writing it in the chat box. Do we have more interventions at this point? We have a young worker, Nico. Would you like to make your comment and ask your question on voice? You can turn on your mic and camera. And I would invite people also to think about what kind of interventions they would like to propose, or, you know, just things that we can think about together. Yes, Nico. You can.
Okay, hello. In solidarity to our brothers and sisters across the Asia Pacific. Now, as a part of the big family in young workers across Asia Pacific, so I think many of us, especially the young workers, will be impacted by this trade negotiations that happening in the background. And thankfully that I was being part of one of the participants in last year seminars that happened, that's being held in Sabah last year regarding on this trade justice or about trade negotiations. So I'm very happy that I'm being attending this webinars again, getting updated on the situations regarding all the negotiations happening around, especially the CTPP and also the RCEP things. And I believe that as in Malaysia, so far as concerned, that the ministers has announced that they are going to proceed with the negotiations. So as a young workers, young unionists, okay, in these regions, in the Asia Pacific, as well as especially in Southeast Asia in particular, on behalf of all my brothers and sisters, the young workers in the union, what the young workers, the young unions can do actually regarding this CTPP and the RCEP, and what the young workers can do, contribute to your fight in this. I mean, your struggles, your what you call your fight to these negotiations. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Do we have any other question, or can we give it back to the panelists who have a lot of questions to answer? Maybe we will ask Sanya to start, and we can take more questions after that too.
Yes, thank you for all these very important questions. So it's true that trade is important for many countries, but if you don't sign these new free trade agreements, of course, trade will continue as it did before the pandemic. I mean, once the lockdowns and so on are lifted. So there were existing, 164 countries already members of the WTO. There are many existing free trade agreements, for example, between all the RCEP countries except India and China. And if countries want to have, for example, cheap masks or medicines, tomorrow they can remove their tariffs on imports of those products unilaterally, voluntarily, without having to sign a free trade agreement to do it. And that means that when the pandemic is over, if they want to build local production capacity, they could raise the tariffs again to start their own domestic industries until they have economies of scale and so on. But if you agree to it, zero tariffs in a free trade agreement, then you're locked in forever, because these free trade agreements usually last until a country withdraws from them. I was very glad to hear that the trade unions in Singapore are consulted by the Ministry of Trade about the free trade agreement negotiations. More governments should do this. And I just wondered whether they showed you the proposed text for these free trade agreements after each round when it changes, and for all chapters. Because, for example, 12 different CPTPP chapters can affect health, so you don't just look at one chapter, you need to look at all of them, including the exceptions and so on. The part about investor-to-state dispute settlement, yes, we are expecting cases to be brought by foreign investors about the things that governments have done to deal with this pandemic and its economic crisis. So on the slides, it showed that Peru has already been threatened with an ISDS case because they said, look, you don't need to pay tolls for using the highway during the pandemic. And we know, for example, during the Arab Spring, there were a lot of ISDS cases about the measures that governments took then, like Egypt raising the minimum wage after the Arab Spring. There were ISDS cases about the global financial crisis in 2008. There were ISDS cases when Argentina had its financial crisis and had to do sovereign debt restructuring and so on. And in fact, the law firms have been holding webinars during the pandemic, trying to get business to sue governments on behalf of investors. So we call this ambulance chasing, because what happens is the law firms say to investors, let us sue the governments because of their lockdowns for you. Don't pay us any money. If you win $1 billion, pay us 10% on a contingency basis. And this is what they did in the Arab Spring. They sent, their newsletter and everything to investors in North Africa and the Middle East, and they said, have you been harmed by the Arab Spring? If you have, let us sue the governments for you using ISDS, and then if you win, pay us 10%. And because of that, a lot of investors sued, and they caused the governments who had to deal with the Arab Spring to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars during the Arab Spring to foreign investors for these kinds of measures. So this is what governments are facing. Nevertheless, some governments are still negotiating new treaties with ISDS or signing them or ratifying them, like the Japan-ASEAN Services and Investment Treaty, which some, as you could see on the slides, have signed. Some have, all have signed, but some have already ratified. Some are thinking about whether to ratify. In RCEP, because of civil society campaigns, including the trade unions, ISDS is not there for the first 2 years, but it could come back after that. And certainly there's ISDS in the CPTPP and the EU free trade agreements and so on. It's true, the point that was raised that free trade agreements are not necessarily about trade. So for example, out of the 30 chapters in the CPTPP, maybe 6 are about what you think of as trade, exporting products like shirts or computers. The other 24 chapters are about your domestic laws, like patents on medicines, or how you regulate workers and whether you can set government procurement for your local suppliers or you have to open it to foreign companies and products and services. And free trade economists like Jagdish Bhagwati have said that the intellectual property protections in these trade rules actually mean that they're not free trade, they're the opposite, they're increasing the monopolies. So Jagdish Bhagwati says that these intellectual property rules should not be in trade agreements because they're about restricting trade. Then something we didn't have time to go into in the presentations, but was on the slides, is the services domestic regulation disciplines, which almost concluded amongst the countries who are negotiating them in the WTO. And they are in some free trade agreements, like the EU is proposing to Indonesia, that you can't change your laws or regulations in this area. So what does that mean? That means that if you have services licensing requirements or technical standards, for example, when restaurants reopen, people need to wear masks. the workers and the customers and everybody, this could violate the services domestic regulation disciplines that are nearly finished in the WTO and that the EU is proposing to Indonesia. Or if you want to set a maximum water price to make sure it's affordable, or you don't allow water to be switched off when people can't pay. These kinds of things can violate the services domestic regulation disciplines, as well as, of course, as labour laws like occupational health and safety, minimum wage, maternity leave, and so on. So, of course, we all hope that there will be a vaccine next year, but the World Health Organization's chief scientist thinks that it will be 4 or 5 years before this pandemic is under control. And we know that some vaccines have taken 28 years to develop. We still don't have vaccines for some diseases like HIV/AIDS. So it's likely that RCEP, for example, will already start operating while we're still dealing with this pandemic and its economic crises, let alone the next pandemic and the next economic crisis. So as Joshua said, the reason for this economic crisis and recession is because of the lockdowns, which are because of the pandemic. So even if Philippines joined 10 free trade agreements tomorrow, it would not help it get out of a recession caused by the pandemic lockdown. The way to get out of the economic recession is to lift the lockdowns. The way to do that is to get the pandemic under control. But as we talked about today, when you join these free trade agreements, it makes it harder to get the pandemic under control, and it makes it harder to deal with the economic crises. So joining these free trade agreements actually, or the new WTO rules, are not necessary to restart the economy. They're not sufficient, and in fact, they even make it harder to revive the economy from the problems caused by this pandemic. So lastly, as Joshua was saying, what are the benefits from something like RCEP? Because the RCEP countries already they're all WTO members, so they already trade at low levels of tariffs because of WTO. Then every RCEP country already has one or more free trade agreements between them, except India and China. And developing countries and least developed countries are generally good at exporting cheap products like rice or shirts or computers. But for example, Australia and New Zealand already have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, where Australia and New Zealand can never have any tariffs on any exports from ASEAN. They are locked at 0% forever. So even if RCEP came into force tomorrow, ASEAN could not export one extra banana or one extra shirt to Australia and New Zealand. Instead, what the ASEAN countries will get are all these other rules in services and investment and so on that makes it harder to deal with the pandemic and its economic crises. Thanks.
Right, just to add on to Sania, yeah, I think Joshua, you have summarized it really well. It's what we've always been saying. We've been asked this question a lot when we are talking to different governments, and I'm sure all of you who have been, having these debates at home with your negotiators and with the government as well. So there's almost this myth that if we don't sign these new agreements or finish up the negotiation of these ongoing things, that the whole world will come to an end. There'll be no trade. It's ridiculous. We've been asked so many questions, Sanya and I, in so many meetings. What if we don't ratify the CPTPP? I will say, you know what? Life goes on, right? We've already liberalized so many parts of our economy. And what are all these agreements we're talking about, from the WTO plurilaterals to all these regional and plurilaterals, or whatever you call them? It's really the big multinational corporations and the banks and the Googles and the Facebook. They are lobbying their governments, right, to push really to open up the last parts of our economy, like government procurement, like intellectual property, privatize our public health services. So all the things we fought against in IMF battles, in privatization, especially PSI members, it's all part of that big paradigm of multinationals. They don't want regulations, they don't want accountability, they just want to move in and out and have rights to sue governments, which is the ultimate, right? So this sort of talk, the way they talk, and that's why I think if you can challenge, negotiators and even the multinational companies in your countries to a public debate, I think that'd be fantastic. We'll find in most countries, when you ask for a public debate, they never come to a public debate, right? Maybe that's what we should push for in the coming, about actions. The other thing I wanted to raise is that, one of the most important things about this pandemic has taught us is the importance and the absolute necessity of a functioning, healthy public health system, right? Because the countries the territories have been able to really, respond quickly despite the chaotic first, days and weeks, to be early intervention, to have public surveillance, to contact and to trace, and to do quarantine and to do treatment, are where the public health system still functions. Malaysia is a good example. Singapore is a good example, except Singapore forgot about migrant workers, right? And then you have Kerala, right? And you have Vietnam in our region. You find really the places where your public health system works. In Malaysia, as I think Lawrence was saying, yes, we actually have done pretty well. That's because of our Ministry of Health, and we had very good civil servants. We have frontline workers, not just the medical side, but all the supporting workers. And that really is the secret. Really, okay? So whether you're Malaysian, we're non-Malaysian citizen, you're a migrant worker who is not documented and so-called illegal, you get sick, you go into the public health system. And that's how they could track and trace, right? So to have a functioning public health system, to make sure that the government could, as Sanya said, in many of our countries, they actually say, no need to pay electricity for the next 3 months, all right? Water supplies, don't cut off people who cannot afford to pay their bills. You can only do this if you can regulate and have a say over those services. And if you privatize, you're going to run into trouble because they may not even do what you ask them to do, or they may do it during the pandemic crisis situation, but they'll come back and sue you, right? So public health systems, it's so crucial. How do you have healthy, functioning public health systems? You need good tax base, right? This is funded by tax. And if you cut off your revenue by having zero tariffs, if you take away the ability of government to tax, which is what the e-commerce chapter is also about, you don't really want to tax. You have investment chapters that say you have to give all kinds of incentive and not be able to tax. You have corporate tax is very low, all the things we've been discussing for many years outside of these trade agreements. And if you cannot control capital flight, right? So all these are the things you need to do to have public money, to do not just public health systems, but to invest in R&D. Why should we be dependent on a few multinational corporations to give us vaccines, which may not come or may not work? And if they work, they're too expensive. And the panic from masks to PPEs to ordinary medicines that are not even patented. Many of us in the region, apart from India, maybe in China, do not have the capacity to even make these things. And they're not difficult to make because our industrial capacity is weak. So all these are the things which should be part of the economic recovery. And to do all this, we need to have policy space, and these rules won't give us that. Now, the issue about what can we do about migrant workers, right? It's not about trade rules as such. The reason, Malaysia, this is the negative side of what's happening in the pandemic, right? We have millions of undocumented workers. We've been talking about this. Many NGOs, even many trade unions have, especially when I went to Sabah, I learned a lot about what unions are doing to help the non-unionized migrant workers, because in the end, we have to take care of each other. It's our common fight, right? So suddenly, the government is deporting, undocumented workers by the thousands. Right? They are scaring them and they're detaining them and they're helping to spread the pandemic in detention centers. Why? Why after all these decades of not addressing the issue of migrant workers who are illegal, suddenly we are suddenly being so righteous, yeah? But the bigger picture, how to deal with informal sector workers. And many of them are not our nationals in our countries in this region. But we are in ASEAN. Where is ASEAN solidarity when we are deporting Indonesian workers and, and Thai workers, etc., among ourselves? So this is a bigger picture. This is a kind of recovery for workers who are informal sectors who are going to not be able to be part of the recovery because those jobs don't exist or they're going to be deported. And that needs real solidarity, not fighting each other over stupid trade agreements where we are competing and not in solidarity. What can young unionists do? It's not our fight or your fight, it's our together fight. Okay, I thought that the discussion we started in Sabah last year was about how to use social media, how to package all these things we are saying in a much more, we need to have a really more sophisticated communication strategy. We talked about this in Sabah last year. The pandemic kind of interrupted our implementation. Let's go back to talk about that, right? I think, Nico, you're absolutely right. We were talking about how to do, and we've seen, how during this pandemic lockdown, social media has become very important for messaging on public health, for people to stay in touch. And we need to really think about how to do that. And we need our younger activists and unionists to work with us on that. The other thing that we had shown in the last slide are some of the sign-on letters, which are still open. These are the kind of moratorium on all negotiations on trade from WTO to FTAs. Let's have that. We also want to stop this plurilateral and this funny, temporary appellate system, which is not very, it's quite worrisome. So there are actions like that we can do. And in every country, in Malaysia, our Banta campaign, our FTA platform, we need to get together in each of our countries to start talking again, maybe face-to-face where we can, or even through, virtually. We got to step up the national campaign. Now, RCEP started off as an ASEAN baby, and that is part of our challenge, right? Because our Prime Minister in Malaysia just gave a speech a couple of days ago, and he said that we are very happy that this thing is coming to an end. We as ASEAN should be the first basically to sign. So it's seen as an ASEAN, so it's geopolitical. It's nothing to do with understanding what's inside there. Our current Minister of International Trade, he said after the virtual ministerial meeting, we have wrapped up the RCEP. Now we're ready to move forward, because he feels, we were told, right or wrong, but we were told he wants, as Minister of International Trade during his term, to say he has at least brought home one FTA to completion. That has got nothing to do with whether it's going to help us recover, deal with the pandemic, or whether it's good for the country. So we have a lot of work to do at the national level. We have done a lot. We're not starting from ground zero. We have done a lot of work before the pandemic. The pandemic makes our arguments, our concerns even stronger. So I think let's go back, think about how we can work at the national level and across the region. We don't see India, frankly, coming back, because the Indian geopolitics is also moving closer to Washington. So there are all these kind of things. The big trade war between China and the US has gone beyond the trade war. It's gone into who is responsible for exporting the the coronavirus. So we're living in a very turbulent world. We don't need more instability, right? So these are some of the things I just wanted to highlight. Lastly, the stimulus packages in Malaysia, the ones that we are most familiar with, all right? If we look at that, it's about helping SMEs. It's about helping it's about helping the Malaysian businesses and the Malaysian economy. There are many, many things there, as Sanya said very correctly. If we just take that against our existing WTO rules that we have agreed to and other agreements, bilateral or ASEAN, we will find that we are already fighting, we are already violating. Now, but we have to be very careful that in our advocacy, we don't want to make our government so worried about being sued that they won't do anything, all right? So we also need to think about how to message it. We're going to make it very clear. If all countries come together and say, we need to do this and we need to do policy space, then we renegotiate or we don't ratify. What is the rush to ratify? So there are many action points already ongoing. We can join, maybe we can follow up to identify what are the different actions we can do. I'll stop there. Thank you. I'm sorry if I spoke really fast.
Thank you very much, both of you. Yes, some of the action points that we can continue discussing and that we can also kind of, develop probably over email discussions with the different groups that are here. The question of the existing letters, this could be either for those who have not signed on, they could be signed on. The young workers could decide to, for instance, discuss them, translate them, see for ways of disseminating them, either within the unions or other unions. The question of working national strategies. In Malaysia, clearly, there is a discussion ongoing, both looking at the RCEP and the CPTPP, and what can be done for each of them. I just want to say also that currently in Thailand, there is a parliamentary ad hoc commission that is looking at what could be the implications of the CPTPP for access to medicines, for the right to food, and for the economy. And that committee allows for groups in Thailand to make a submission and put their perspective forward. So that could be an opportunity that could be considered for the groups in Thailand. So that's something for groups to discuss and see if there would be an interest in doing that. And then, of course, I think one point for me that came strongly, it's also the importance of having sound public services depends on the ability of government to have the finances they need. We had already worked around the question of tariffs, the question of the taxing digital products, or the ban on taxing digital products could be something else that we want to take on. It would be good to maybe take that discussion further and see how it can be taken, in which countries, for instance, there would be interest for that. And then maybe also see if there could be some short videos that can be done as part of the discussion on how to disseminate the information, right? Short videos can be used, even if it is to make the kind of content that we discussed today a bit more accessible by having, you know, these 2-3 minutes videos that can be then shared and translated to different languages. I just want to go back to the chat because there is interesting discussions going on in the group chat. One of them is about the question of consultations, the limitation of consultation, the need still to make public pressure on governments. That I think is important to note that, you know, there is a contract. I think for me the point is that, for instance, in the RCEP, there has been a formal consultation process, which while it is important to use, it has also been very frustrating because it is a space where civil society and trade unions are allowed to give their perspective, but there is no reason to believe that it is taken into account. So it's like talking to a white wall. So also rethinking, how do we put pressure using those spaces, but also how do we put pressure for maybe public debates, maybe using the parliamentary processes more, can be also things that we can explore. The other discussion that is going on in the chat is the question of the export bans. I think there is Asad Urrehman from Pakistan. I think asked an important question that we could debate a bit more, you know, which is, Asad, would you like to intervene by voice and make your comment and your point directly, or would you like me to read it? Asad?
His microphone doesn't work.
Okay, so I will just read it for everyone to know, and I think we should just take a bit of time to discuss this. Basically, his point is that looking at trade policies, the government of Pakistan has exempted medical and other health equipment from import taxes, right? It's difficult that the objectives of importing enough will be met in the short 3 months that this exemption was given. And there is a acute shortage of these goods. That shortage is also linked to the fact that many countries have imposed export bans, yes. So would Pakistan joining a trade agreement impact on this? How will it impact on this? So in this context, should Pakistan consider becoming part of a global alliance, even if not immediately later on? So basically, how does this impact on the possibility to have access to these life-saving goods? And probably linking this to the question from Pratnya about, you know, MSMEs and infant protection, infant industry protection. So I think if you can speak a bit more about how the policy space for infant protection gets impacted by trade agreements, and how does that impact MSMEs? I'm just scrolling down to see if there is any further question. No. So if we can just have one more round on this, and during that time, if anyone else would like to also intervene on some of the action points, that would be very welcome. Okay, so maybe Satya, if you want to respond.
Yeah, so just responding firstly to Asad's, yes, so Pakistan has unilaterally removed tariffs on imported masks or medical equipment, and it can do that for as long as it wants. It can say something like, until this pandemic is under control, or it could set 5-10 years, it's up to it. But if Pakistan joined joined the WTO proposal, for example, by New Zealand, that would say forever, no WTO members can have tariffs on imported masks. That means after this pandemic is over, Pakistan could not raise the tariffs on imported masks in order to build its own mask producing industry to be ready for the next pandemic. And we know that all economies except Hong Kong use this infant industry tariff protection of raising the tariffs on imported products until your local suppliers can compete. So for example, Indonesia did it also by government procurement. When they wanted to have a plywood industry, they said, we're going to raise the export taxes, in this case on wood, but also the government will buy wooden furniture from Indonesian manufacturers. And this, within 10 years, made Indonesia's plywood industry, I think, have 80% of world market share from being uncompetitive. So these kinds of ways you can use to build up your domestic supply capacity of these critical products, whether it's medicines or masks, so that in the next pandemic, you don't have to try and import it from somewhere and there's not enough like there was this time. These kinds of ways of dealing with it and building up your local domestic industry are not possible if you lock it in these free trade agreements or in the WTO, where the proposals are you never have tariffs on imported masks, even between the pandemic when you want to build a domestic production capacity. And so there was a question about infant industries and MSMEs. And so I wrote in the chat that what you see in some free trade agreements like the CPTPP is they say, don't worry, we have an MSME chapter. But this is not an exception for micro, small and medium enterprises from any of the rules. What it is, it's just whitewashing to say, look, we have this nice chapter, but inside the chapter it just says, let's have a website and have a committee to talk about MSMEs, and the chapter is not enforceable. So MSMEs cannot really be exempted from the rules because they are in the whole economy, right? MSMEs make all kinds of products and do all kinds of services. So how would you exempt them? What we see in the government procurement liberalization in free trade agreements is they usually try to keep the small contracts for locals so that then MSMEs can supply, you know, the cakes for a meeting in the government or something like that. But what we see in the state-owned enterprise chapter, for example, in the CPTPP, is that when you talk about a state-owned company like Petronas or Malaysian Airlines, and it has to open its purchasing, it has to open it even for the smallest contracts. Even the $1 contracts of buying bananas to serve to people on the Malaysian Airlines flights must be liberalized to the cheapest one from any of the other countries in the free trade agreement. So there's no exception for MSMEs there. Then there was a question raised by Shubham Sharma about whether these trade agreements can help economic recovery from the pandemic. So what we see some people say is if you do computable general equilibrium modeling about the impacts of these free trade agreements, it shows that you will get wonderful economic growth. GDP will increase. But this is based on assumptions like, let's assume these free trade agreements do not cause any unemployment. And let's assume these free trade agreements do not cause any loss in government revenue. So the assumptions are heavily criticized by other economists. And even then, even with all these unrealistic assumptions, you know, of 100% liberalization, and for example, with the US still in the TPP, the US government found pre-pandemic that the TPP would cause Malaysia's GDP to increase by 0.01% by 2025, with all those unrealistic assumptions. And what it doesn't take into account is the costs, for example, of unaffordable medicines, unaffordable seeds, unaffordable agricultural inputs, your balance of payments worsening because your imports increase by more than your exports and so on. And so if we look at RCEP in particular, how is this supposed to help ASEAN recover? Because as I said earlier, under the existing free trade agreements between ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand, for example, already have 0 tariffs on every single product from ASEAN forever. They can never raise their tariffs on ASEAN exports. So how can RCEP enable ASEAN to sell any extra bananas or shirts or mobile phones to Australia and New Zealand? There's no new market access. And furthermore, we know what caused this economic recession. It's the lockdowns. It was a sudden stop to the economy, man-made, in order to control the pandemic. So the solution to that is lift the lockdowns. But how do you lift the lockdowns? You can only do that once you have the pandemic under control. And for that, you need masks, you need medicines, you need vaccines. You need to be able to say when we lift it, it's at 50% capacity and so on. And all of these solutions are not possible if you agree to these proposed trade rules, either in free trade agreements or in the World Trade Organization. So in fact, these proposed trade rules would make it harder to deal with the pandemic and harder to deal with the economic crises that are coming out of the pandemic, like capital running out of the country, you need to restructure your government debt, you have balance of payments problems, you want to subsidize your local companies but not the foreign companies to bail them out, and so on. So what these trade rules that are being negotiated now by our governments would do is make it harder to deal with the pandemic, harder to deal with the economic crises, and delay the economic recovery rather than help it. So the good news is that in many of your countries, there are existing CSOs campaigning on these issues. You don't have to do it all by yourself, starting from scratch. So in Thailand, there is FTA Watch. In Malaysia, there is Banta. In the Philippines, I forget what your network is called, but I know you have one, Trade Justice or something. In India, there's another one. And so people on this call can put you in touch with those existing campaigning networks in Bangladesh and so on, so that you can join existing campaigns and do, whether it's social media or press releases or lobbying your government, whatever you normally do to influence your government about any of these trade rules that might be a problem for your country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanya. Thank you very much to both Sanya and you. Sanya, I think you've finished on this note of how, despite what we are kind of sold, the narrative that free trade agreements are to improve the economy, going back to the beginning, there is actually no evidence to that. Not only there is no evidence to that, we are seeing today how these agreements are actually doing the opposite. Now, to finish on an even more positive note, I think it's also interesting to see how the kind of wind behind this agreement is kind of going down. We have seen that, you know, there was this very strong push for the CPTPP that is very aggressive and has very stringent rules. Now, not all countries have ratified it. And when the RCEP came in, there was a very strong civil society, trade union, many sectors came together to oppose it to. And there is a certain amount of success in removing some of the harmful elements of RCEP. And I think if we were to put it in the balance, while both are bad, some of the things have been removed of RCEP. The investor-state dispute settlement has been removed of RCEP. The e-commerce and digital issues, some of them have been removed from RCEP. So we have a situation where I think it's becoming more and more difficult for governments to openly kind of give strong evidence-based arguments of what is it that they are trying to get out of this agreement. And I think we can also see that these negotiations are becoming more and more secretive as they are getting in more and more trouble. For RCEP, probably the exit of India from the discussions, which is the result of a campaign in which PSI affiliates joined with other civil society, other unions came together. It had a very strong impact, and that has put the RCEP in a situation where there is a question mark if it will be signed at all. So we need to keep that pressure and keep that pressure knowing that it actually has an impact, and we can really ensure that these agreements do not get concluded and that they do not set a situation where the current problems we see in the economy continue, and that we can actually propose alternatives. So with this, I would like to thank everyone for joining today. I would like to thank the interpreter also, who has done a very good job alone, and the speakers who spoke a bit fast. So thank you so much, Not. Thank you also for Nico and Trimita and Denise for helping organizing the workshop. And we will be in touch with all of you to see how we continue with concrete actions from unions together in this struggle. Thanks everyone. Bye.